Hello, and welcome to an episode of Turnipy Stuff. Pretty much got my army finished, but I need to make some toadies, who are the sub-leaders of your army. Jumping right in, I raided my bits box, and found a suitable selection of torsos, going for that kind of Napoleonic, but also cultist vibe. So there'd be one toady for the more uniform troops, and two more raggedy kind of preacher types. To make the two preachers, I primarily used Frostgrave wizard parts, opting to have each of them carrying a large book, so they could be inspiring the troops with the teachings of the Turnip Pope as they go along. I opted for an open hand on one of them, and a staff for the other, and for heads I looted around until I found some suitably disgusting heads. This one is from the Stargrave scavenger kit, and it's meant to be a zombie head, but the fleshy parts are still intact, so it suits a kind of harrowed, diseased looking preacher. Moving to the other one, this was from the Wizards 2 kit from Frostgrave, and I opted for a staff because the crystal at the top could easily be painted to look like a rusty nail, and that seemed quite fun. Then I narrowed it down to two heads from the Frostgrave Cultist 2 sprue, and opted to go for the one with the leather face style mask. For the final toady, I wanted a guy a bit more uniform to match the kind of Napoleonic troops I had. The basis for this model was Conquistador torso from Wargames Atlantic, with a shoulder coat from Victrix, and a sword from a Perry Napoleonic heavy cavalryman. I wanted him to have a kind of fancy yet practical hat. I found a suitable one on a Fireforge sprue, which I think was from Scandinavian Infantry, which has a kind of slightly modern yet medieval look to it. But they needed to look a bit more horrible, so I cracked out the milliput and gave them some fur mantles. Milliput is a nice crafting material. Get it in two parts, mix them together, and you get a clay-like substance which you can sculpt. Dries quite quickly, and it takes detail pretty well if you get the super fine white version. To make the cloaks, I took some balls of it, and smushed them onto the back of the model, with some smaller balls pushed around them, so you'd get that kind of non-uniform look that fur cloaks often have. Or at least they do if they're badly made, which in this game they definitely are. Then taking the pointy edge of a sculpting tool, I poked a fur texture into the mantle. This is fairly easy to replicate. You just work your way around, putting lines in, and then stabbing with a triangular end, so you get some more defined tufts of fur. I always end up mixing too much of the milliput, so I turn the excess into basing material, and then play around with a few texture things, so I can experiment, and make some mushrooms that I can then use on basing later. Seeing as these models have integrated bases, that can look a bit weird, so you need to blend the bases together. I use the Vallejo ground texture paste, and I use two different types for this. The kind of white asphalt one is a bit chunkier, so if you push it into the edges of the integrated base, it fills in most of the gap between the two bases. Then taking the Vallejo ground texture paste, I apply a layer over the top, so you get a nice blend of the two dirt textures, as the earth texture is a fair bit finer. The combination of the two gives you a nice little variety, and it stops it looking quite so uniform, as it might if you used only one of the two. I waited a day for the ground textures to dry fully, then went in with a layer of black gesso and primed the entire thing. I followed this up with a dark brown base coat, and a kind of heavy dry brush application, leaving the very recesses black. Then taking a tan colour and a large brush, I applied a bit of a zenithal brown highlight over the top. With the base values established, I went in and applied the colour. So to match the infantryman I had, I painted the officer type guy with a white coat and a pinky purple trim. You don't need to be too precise here, as it'll get mucked up later. I'm picking out a few white tones on the other two, so they'd match the colour scheme as well. Using a dark silver to highlight the metallics, and a dark reddy kind of brown colour to pick out the tunic and the overcoats of the two preachers. I also wanted them to match the turnip theme, so on the white rose I took a pink purple colour, watered it down and applied it on the base so you get a bit of a blend working up from the base of the model, and it would kind of look a bit like a turnip. Using a flesh colour, I then picked out the highlights on the hands and the faces, but left enough of the brown and black in the recesses, so they'd still look pretty horrible. They still look too clean at this point, so with watered down Tempest Brown from AK Interactive, I gave them all a dark glaze. Using a clean brush, to pick out the highlights and put some of the colour back in, and generally just pushing the glaze to the bottom part of the model, as well as the deeper recesses. Once that wet layer was fully dry, I applied a few glazes, such as a red highlight so you get a bit of the blood flow back into the faces, and an orangey colour to put a layer of rust in the crevices of the helmet, as well as the breastplate. To add some wear and tear, I then applied some mud around the base of the models, on the base of the coat, the trouser legs, as well as the hems of the robes, which also blends it into the bases and makes a nice transition. I also used a fine brush to fill in the text on the books, as well as some doodles of root vegetables. It is, after all, the word of the Turnip Pope. Moving on to the bases, I grabbed some foam flock, which I mixed with matte Mod Podge, so you can make a kind of basing slime, and use it for some swampy vegetation on top of the mud bases. Kept the bases to a very simple colour scheme, dark brown, followed by a light dry brush of tan. This kind of slimy foliage paste can be a real pain to apply, but it gives you a nice result, and it does not come off once it's stuck, so you won't find tiny pieces of flock around your storage bags. Once dry, to blend it in, I took more of the watered down Tenebrous Brown and applied a light glaze, followed by a dusting of brown paint over the top, so you get some dying vegetation in there as well. Then, with the addition of 1 or 2 choice tufts, the basing was done. So we have 3 happy toadies, ready to join the Turnip Pope's army, and each one of them has a kind of linked unit that it would be put with in the game, with the officer getting the more uniformed troops, and the 2 preachers getting the mass kind of culty, insane people rabble. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to catch you next time.